Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today I have my June wrap-up. June was actually quite a good month in terms of reading for me. More about finding books that I actually enjoyed as opposed to reading a lot of books, but I will talk about that as we go on. Firstly, there are two books that I can't talk about because I read them for the BookTube prize, but you can expect my thoughts on them when we're announcing the rankings next month. And those books are The Innocents by Michael Crummey and The Night Tiger by Yangsze Choo, which gives me just a few more books to talk about. The first book that I read in June was The Old Drift by Namwali Serpell. This is a book set over about 100 years in a village near the Zambezi River. It chronicles the lives of different families living during these times, and each part of the book focuses on a different generation. We begin with 3 stories about the grandmothers, then we move on to 3 stories about the mothers before then moving on to 3 stories set closer to the modern day about the children. This way of breaking apart the story reminded me somewhat of Homegoing by Yangsze, and I appreciated that. I really liked seeing how the lives of these people interwove throughout the century. The only review that I've seen of this book came from Matthew of MCS Books over a year ago now. When I first mentioned I planned reading this book alongside Cloud Atlas, he mentioned that the books are quite similar in style, and I understand that now, in that with Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, the stories have some sort of link between them, but it's a series of different short pieces creating an entire novel, and that is what I got here. I got 9 different stories that all came together, that told this story about the different classes and people within this society by the Zambezi River. When it began, there was something very fairy tale in the tone that I quite liked. The first story mentions the character of Sibylla. Here we have a character who is completely covered in hair, and even when the hair is chopped off, it grows back extremely quickly. And this was somewhat reminiscent of Rapunzel and that fairy tale. It twisted it somewhat in that they would plant the hair in the ground and it would grow, and I really liked the story of Sibylla. I found it fast-paced, and then we moved into the next story where this question of blindness but having eyes beneath the skin. And there were these moments in the first few stories that definitely had fairy tale folkloric aspects that I appreciated. Similarly to David Mitchell's work, Namwali Serpell here has blended many genres in her work. You do have a touch of romance to a lot of the stories that I didn't necessarily feel was needed, but I understand why it was there, so that we could link these families up, and it was a big part of these people's lives. So whilst I didn't like it, I understood why there was this touch of romance to each story, even though it wasn't necessarily the main discussion within this book. It's quite a large book. It definitely needs rereading and re-exploring now that I've read the entire thing. This is the first time I've read a book and had to make use of the family tree at the beginning of a book to figure out who everyone is and how they relate to one another. This wasn't a problem, but it's just that this is a book you really have to take your time over and focus on. And I did. I spent a fortnight just reading this book, taking my time, getting to know these characters. Of course, there were characters that I liked more than others, but I did like this book that talked about issues that we've had in the world, such as disease and trying to cure these diseases. We move into discussing technology, and this fairy tale folkloric sense that we had at the beginning of the book is now more of a science fiction aspect, and I think that that was done extremely well, because when a certain technological aspect of this book appeared, I was like, does that actually exist? Is this something in the world? And I even went and I was looking up to find out whether it was something that had ever been thought of before. There is this touch of the government getting involved, and at the beginning of this book there is this sense that there's something political with the army being featured, and it beginning with quite a very distinct idea of class, but that began to get challenged throughout, and people really moved due to their circumstances, and it had this great sense of family about it and how family can be broken apart. The end of the book and the final part where we're in the modern day and we're discussing the children's lives was where it began to get a bit more plot heavy and all of the pieces began to settle into place. It's definitely a book I'll be keeping. I tend to get rid of the books I haven't liked, but I do think that it will take another read for me to properly solidify my opinions on this one, because I like it, but I don't think that it's the greatest thing I've ever read, but I really appreciate the scope of the novel and the different genres blending together in this. This is the writer's first novel, and the idea that this is somebody's first novel is something that should be lauded because it's a very thought out book. There's a point towards the end where you find out who the narrator of all these stories has been. Everything then makes sense in a similar fashion to, rather than Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, Ghost written by David Mitchell, and getting this sense of who the narrator might have been in that book. I got that same sense here, and having enjoyed the work of David Mitchell this year, I was extremely pleased to have discovered this book. And I will say there are certain stories in here that I would prefer to go back and reread over others, but I feel as though that would be the case with any book of this. And I think it's definitely a book that if you are looking for a very expansive, thought out, in-depth book that you just want to spend a lot of time over, then you do well to read this book. Next, I read Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo. At 74 years old, Barrington Walker, or Barry as he's known to everyone else, has decided that he is going to leave his wife of a very significant amount of time for his male lover, who all came over to England about 50 years ago, and Barry has kept that relationship secret for that time. His wife, Carmel, is aware that Barry has been cheating on her, but he believes that it's been with various different women over the years. She does not know that Barry has actually been having a relationship with Morris for years. Earlier this year, I read Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. Whilst I enjoyed the book and I've kept it to have another look at, I appreciated the writing. I didn't feel like it was there, and I don't know whether that came from being too hyped up. But when Simon of Savage Reads was talking about this book earlier this year, I knew that I had to read it, and that came from the fact that it's about older characters. And if you didn't know, I really like seeing older characters represented in fiction. This might have become one of my favourite books immediately. It is so humorous, and sometimes I talk about what I wish I had had the skill to do with Our Doris. I reference it here because this is the style of writing here is exactly what I wish I had had the skill to do all those years ago, because this book has pathos and humour. It discusses the insecurities we feel about being older, and it has this older gay man now knowing that the world is accepting and wanting to accept himself. And that is what this story is about. This is about this man learning to accept himself at a very late stage in life, wanting to eliminate any regrets he might have had. We have a protagonist who isn't a hero, and we can feel sorry for him, but at the same time know that the actions he has taken in the past have been wrong. And I like that, and I liked being able to sympathise with the character, but also recognise that other characters within the book, his family members, might have had very different ideas as to his actions. And you get to see the sense of Barry always thought he was doing right by his family, but his family might not necessarily have seen his actions in the same light. And I really like that. And I liked how the author would show us Barry's actions, but then also show us the reactions to that, and how his behaviour had actually had long-standing effects on his family, on his daughters, on his wife. What I also think was good is that Evaristo included discussions of sex in the older community, because for some reason we've perpetuated this myth that sex really stops at 50, and showing that people can still engage in sex post 70, well, I appreciate Evaristo for doing that. It's something that I've included in Indisputably Doris and Doris Ahoy, because it's something that we should acknowledge, that people still have lives to live after the age of 70 added this level of realness to the book. The author might not have impressed me the most with Girl, Woman, Other, but there is so much in this book to unpack, and I really think the author did an absolutely fantastic job with this book, and I'm glad to have discovered it, and I recommend it to everyone, really. Then I read Cleanness by Garth Greenwell. A few years ago, I read What Belongs to You by the author, and I wasn't the biggest fan of that book. I found it to be written in an incredibly pretentious style that told the story, didn't really show us anything, and the only time that the writer ever really wanted to use any sort of craft came when he wanted to talk about sex and have explicit sex scenes. And that's what this book is, really. I bought it after watching Sarah of Hardcover Hearts do a deep dive with Leo of A Little Book Life and Dan of Weird Book Club. Their discussion had me read this, and I appreciate their discussion, and you should definitely go and watch them if you've read the book, because they had a better opinion of this than me. I still feel as though the prose here is incredibly pretentious. I don't feel as though the writer actually shows you any sort of story at all. He just has these sex scenes that show us the dominant and submissive roles of sex and how they can be pushed to the extremes in gay culture. And I just don't understand what the story was here. It felt as though the author once again was just trying too hard to be literary, and in doing so forgot that there actually needs to be some sort of story here. And I understand not giving the characters names, just referring to them as letters, giving this sense of detachment for the reader so that they can never fully properly feel as though they're inside the story with the author, with the characters. But at the end of the day, I just feel like it was this extremely trite mess of a book, and that if you really wanted to, you could just go and find these sorts of sex scenes on any sort of free erotica based site out there. I feel as though Garth Greenwell has been lauded as this really fantastic writer because he is so explicit when he writes about sex. But we shouldn't see someone who's writing gay sex scenes as that's why they're a good writer, because they included. The writing still has to be good. There still has to be a story there still has to be a sense of character. And all I got was nearly 200 pages of someone just meandering through life, giving us various takes on different sex scenes, different feelings that he had for different people over time, without any real sense of who the characters were, without a sense of their histories or what was really going on in the story. And it's just like, here's an anecdote, here's an anecdote, here's an anecdote, I've reached my word count, I'm done. So I really do think that I have to stop reading Garth Greenwell, because it's 2 books in now. I don't like their writing style. I don't think I'll ever like their writing style, and I don't understand why this book has been so hyped. And I think that we have seen a lot of people discuss this book and get a lot of good reviews, so we're searching for what they found. It's not that good. Next, I read Kingdom of Souls by Rena Barron. This is a young adult fantasy novel following the character of Ara, who's a non-magic person in a magical world. But if she wants to gain some magic, she could trade years of her life to get access to it. This book discusses orishas, which I've only recently found out about, and it was a part of mythology that I was really grateful to discover. In the community in which Ara lives, her mother is very high up in the world and has a lot of influence. And at the beginning of this book, you are told that children have been going missing, and Ara begins to investigate where these children might have gone after one of her friends ends up going missing themselves. To be quite honest with you, when I picked this book up, I was looking for a very fast-paced young adult fantasy novel that would help me get back into the swing of things with my reading. I wanted something quick that I didn't really have to think about, and I got that here. Saying that, I do feel as though the first 200 pages where the author was setting up the world building were slow and measured and very well done. But then from the page 200 point onwards, and there's about 500 pages here, it began to move extremely quickly and we were having plot points thrown at us. And I just wanted the author to have slowed down a bit. But at the same time, it gave it this pace that I think you only really see in young adult literature, and I can understand why it was there. So I think that this is a really great young adult fantasy novel, and I hope more readers have read it and reviewed it and found it fantastic. I did find that I became somewhat emotionally invested in the characters. I liked the expansive world. I liked the discussion of the gods and the Orishas and the demons, and I appreciated the discussion of family and revenge and how we sometimes have to come to terms with our parents' actions. At the same time, I still just feel like that second half of the book really moved too fast. I feel like we hit a peak at the page 200 mark and then we didn't kind of allow any more troughs, we didn't allow any more lulls in the writing. There were certain YA tropes here that I expected, and I think that people who read young adult fantasy more will like. I found the book a bit too predictable for my taste, but at the same time, I'm keeping the book and I'm looking forward to the sequel and seeing how it all pans out. I don't know, it's a bit like with the Poppy War, in that I was able to acknowledge the faults the Poppy War had, but at the same time, I really wanted to see how things turned out and became a bit invested in the characters' lives. I think that Rena Barron has done a very good job at showing the struggles that Ara has, looking at her parents for guidance and searching for some sort of acceptance from her mother, who has this disappointment that she has so much magic but her daughter does not. I liked that conversation and that thread that ran throughout the entire narrative. Sometimes I look for books that would remind me of the feeling I got when I used to watch Xena Warrior Princess, and this book really gave me that, and it did move quickly, and I did want a fast book. So maybe I should have expected it to move fast. I don't know. I don't want to pick apart my thoughts on this one. I think that it's a great YA fantasy novel that more people should read, and that maybe I've got too used to stories having very slow progression. And I'm looking at Robin Hobb here. Maybe I have to stop looking at Robin Hobb as the pinnacle of fantasy. Then I read Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez. I read this in one day. It is a superbly written piece following the character of Jesse, a young Jehovah's Witness who is outed to his family as gay and thus ends up running away to London, where he ends up engaging in sex work. That's not all this book is about. This book is an exploration of the two warring sides of religion and sexuality, searching for a family after you've lost your own. We're at the turn of the century. We're at the year 2000, entering into 2002. It moves a lot in time, this book. I don't know how to explain it other than I think it's a really well-written book. Reading this book in the same month as Cleanness showed me what Garth Greenwell really didn't get in his own writing. Paul Mendez gives us a character we can sympathise with, as well as discussing similar topics from that book. This book explores the fetishization of black bodies, and it also explores class, and it discusses some of the topics we don't often see discussed in fiction in relation to the gay subculture and life, by bringing in this talk of music and how music can kind of pinpoint points in our lives. And this book felt as though it had this cinematic quality because certain songs would get mentioned, and it enhanced the story for me somewhat because I felt as though, oh yeah, I can place the character in this time period now. Of course, the time when Jesse actually arrives in London, I was about 8 years old, maybe 10, I can't remember. I was a child, but I know of the songs he's talking about. And I don't know whether anyone else has seen Russell T Davies's Queer as Folk. And this book felt similar to that in this coming-of-age story where Jesse is finding his own identity outside of the one that has been placed upon him by his family. He's also aware that throughout the novel, that he never really knew his father. So there is an aspect of his life that he knows nothing about. And it's this journey of self-discovery and self-acceptance once again. I feel like this book could be read alongside Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, especially in the end. The final scenes in Girl, Woman, Other and Rainbow Milk seem to mirror one another, and reading this almost changed my opinion of Girl, Woman, Other, and it felt as though they could really work well to be read around the same time. I'd be interested to see if anyone else had similar thoughts on that one. But yeah, if you haven't read this book, I recommend you go out and you get this book, and yeah, it was a good one. And I finally finished Forced Out by Kevin Maxwell. I've told the story before about how I was watching Dinner Ladies Series 2 Episode 1 and I wondered where the actor who played Paul had ended up, only to discover that Kevin Maxwell had become a detective and wrote this book after experiencing homophobia and racism on the police force for his 11 years of service. This goes into the fight that he faced against the police force and certain aspects that I didn't know about. So often in this country, England and the UK to be exact, we always see racism as being an American issue. And this book really highlights that it isn't. Also, at a time when we're discussing the police in such a fashion, it makes sense to read this book and understand the systematic racism that is unconsciously there. And throughout this book, you will see where police have mentioned certain actions they've taken to fight racism and to fight homophobia, only for Kevin Maxwell to reveal what actually went on. When I was reading this book, I didn't think that it was written in the best fashion. It felt very much as though we were being presented with fact after fact, and I'd expected more of a memoir. However, as the story moved on, I had this sense that maybe what Kevin Maxwell was doing was presenting us with the facts and trying not to manipulate the reader emotionally, in order that if the story is presented in a fact-based manner, people are more likely to accept what is being said, because there are certain instances where I had to check myself and think, well, about things where I thought things might have been better than they were, and then having the truth exposed. And there was sometimes this sense of disbelief and having to say, well, actually, you're being told it happened, and it's just the shock having to accept that something like this could have gone on for so many years and had been twisted in such a way. I said at the beginning that I could sympathise with the author because of the working class background he was talking about, having his home demolished, and I could remember when the block of flats I originally lived in as a child was demolished, and there was this sense of kinship there that I kind of felt with the author. And then it was moving, then there were certain aspects where Maxwell was having to fight back against certain things that were happening in the police force, and I was thinking back to the very first time I was employed and some of the stuff that went on then that I tend not to talk about, and I was thinking about how I'd been affected by that and the stress that I'd been affected by that Maxwell goes through here when he ends up getting diagnosed with depression. It highlighted for me one of the reasons why I've avoided going to doctors before, and also gave me this sense of, well, I clearly did not have things as bad as this author did, and I didn't have experience nearly as bad as the writer has gone through. But at the same time, when he's reading reports towards the end that have been sent about his own mental health and everyone's saying, just don't be too sensitive, that was just like a red rag to a bull for me. It fueled this anger inside me, as a lot of this book did. Originally, I was reading this book slowly, doing 2 chapters a day, simply because each chapter would make me angry. But yesterday, I decided just to read through the entire thing. This book made me angry, but at the same time, it gave me this sense of hope that if we continue to expose things, as Maxwell has done, and had the strength and wherewithal to write this book, that if we continue to educate ourselves about these things, hopefully in future we can eradicate them and stop them from happening. Whilst it's not the style of memoir I would ordinarily read, whilst it does end up heavily fact-based and there are tons of notes in the back to go and check out, I am grateful for the things that I have learned, feel sympathetic towards the author for what he has experienced, but grateful that he chose to share what he went through with the world and that he chose to fight back as he did. And as it says on the front, a story of prejudice and resilience, and that is definitely what you are getting here. And them's the books. If you have read any of them and would like to discuss them, then please feel free to do so down in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.